Versailles, a hunting lodge built by Louis XIII on a low hill, surrounded by stinking malarial marshes, was transformed by his son into the greatest palace in Europe. Louis XIII's modest building was his refuge from Paris, the court, and women. For his son, it was the sun around which other worlds revolved, and he was the Sun King. More than a palace, Versailles was a theatre, a stage upon which Louis was the chief actor. The gardens were the auditorium in which his audience applauded a consummate performance. Over 4 million people a year visit the palace, and at 15 euros a head, that's quite some income. But as always, twice as many visit the gardens. And why do they come? To pay homage to a long-dead king? Or perhaps just to enjoy a spectacle which no longer has a purpose? Perhaps they no longer understand the purpose it did have. The age of absolute monarchy has long since passed. The gardens and fountains, especially the fountains, need no dry political explanation. They were created for beauty and delight, and will long inhabit their role in the mythology of Versailles. In building Versailles, Louis had hoped to demonstrate what a great king he was. And of course it worked. So every other tin-pot little king in Europe had to have his own version. Sometimes it seemed that the smaller the kingdom, the greater the palace. The Hall of Mirrors was the greatest interior in Versailles, and soon every palace in Europe had its own version, where courtiers could strut and preen, shake their frills and feathers, and generally feel themselves to be quite godlike. But an absolute necessity was a grand canal, preferably with something ornamental and decorative at the end of it. Louis's schemes were not exactly modest, and his gardens were 2 kilometers long. The 3 kilometers at Caserta may seem to be pushing it a bit. Louis never had enough water to make all his fountains play at the same time, but fortunately, most other people did. Louis encouraged frivolity in his gardens. As long as people were being frivolous, they weren't plotting against him. In 1664, he held the first of his great fetes, the Pleasures of the Enchanted Isle. For 4 days, the gardens were host to over 12,000 spectators. 3 plays by Molière, ballets by Lully, pavilions, fireworks, actors, water spectacles, and illuminated groves truly made Versailles into an enchanted isle, and left no doubt as to who alone in his greatness could create such spectacle. Garden was built to entertain and distract and create a perfect world from which exile was unthinkable. Thus were the aristocracy of Europe castrated by jets of water. In Italy, imitating Versailles was sometimes carried to excess. The King of Sardinia built versions of it surrounding his capital of Turin, and that was in a country which wasn't much bigger than Wales. This isn't a palace as you might be tempted to think. No, it's a simple hunting lodge with the king and his friends. However, Italy had invented the water garden and its associated spectacles. Maria de' Medici, Louis's grandmother, had been brought up in Florence and was well acquainted with the bubbly gardens, and it's rather suspected that her stories of her childhood were what whetted Louis's appetite in the first place. But today the bubbly gardens are a bit of a sad spectacle. Italy hasn't got the amount of money the French had to restore the glory of the past. The one thing Italy does have, though, is an abundant supply of water, something which Louis never did have. Italian fountains can run all the time. At Versailles, the water is strictly rationed to weekends, when the price of admission goes steeply up. The palace was built for public display, and the drama needed its audience. The shades of the past occasionally resurrect themselves, and as the centuries merge, the pleasures of the enchanted isle are born again. As night falls and the groves and avenues darken, and music seeps through the air, Versailles gathers back to itself its old actors to evoke a hint of its former greatness. The shades of Louis, the drums and eagles of the Grand Army, the musketeers and Swiss guards of the ancient regime, the illuminated groves and fountains meet their audience again, and yet again the pleasures of the enchanted eye play their seductions on a willing public. An international audience, mindless of cause, reason, or history. Still, the people of France paid for it, and are still doing so. They are entitled to enjoy it in whatever way they see fit. Eventually, even Louis began to feel overwhelmed by the monster he had created. So he built himself a small, intimate palace with only a couple of hundred rooms, where he could be alone with his closest friends. Unfortunately, the costs of the upkeep of the Grand Trianon soon exceeded that of the palace itself. Perhaps the main chateau could be called bombastic, overwhelming, and anything else. But the Grand Trianon, it's delightful and quite livable in. It became the private retreat of the kings, almost a sort of garden cottage at the end of the main garden. Economy was something which Louis did not altogether understand. After all, he'd convinced himself that he was the greatest king in Europe, and as such was entitled to live in the kind of surroundings the greatest king in Europe deserved. It was just a pity it cost so much money to keep it there. Eventually, the state exchequer was absolutely beggared, or indeed buggered, by Louis's ambitions.
Bonsoir mesdames et messieurs et bienvenue au château.
Merci.
Je vous présente la garde suisse. Vous nous faites un redoublement de tambour. S'il vous plaît, tout de suite. Merci, monsieur.
This place cannot be kept up by a skeleton staff. Eventually, the city of Versailles was built to house the employees of the palace. It was always being extended. Life at Versailles could be rigorous and tiring. Woe betide the man who could not discharge his duties in the correct manner.
Mélancolique, solitaire et réveillé
Louis XIV built it, his great-grandson Louis XV simply enjoyed it, and his grandson Louis XVI died for it. An overdue building account of the people of France was settled in full in the shadow of the scaffold. Louis's greatest passion, however, was for flowers. They were perhaps his greatest extravagance. 200,000 plants are still laid out in the gardens each year to evoke a wistful memory of their former glory. For Louis, bedding schemes were changed overnight by an army of gardeners. His guests could retire charmed by beds full of pansies and wake to the prospect of ornamental cabbages. This was the realm of flora. He demanded more and more flowers, and acres of greenhouses were built so that the king could indulge his passion, sometimes unwisely. On one notorious occasion, his guests, suffering dreadful headaches, were driven from an evening at the Grand Trienal by the overpowering scent of tuberoses. The only man to whom Louis would allow himself to defer was André Lenotre, his humble gardener. Architects, designers, furniture makers, and ministers could easily be retired in disgrace, but to Lenotre, the genius behind the gardens, Louis remained unswervingly and uncharacteristically loyal. This most ephemeral of creations is the outstanding legacy of the Sun King, and one where we willingly become admiring courtiers. Louis' theatre still serves its purpose. Neither you nor I, dear friend, have starved to provide another man's pleasure. The Enchanted Isle was indeed an island, isolated from the world by 43 kilometers of enclosing walls and protected by 22 guarded gates. But outside those gates there was little enchantment. The people in whose name this was built, slowly starved, were brutally conscripted or punitively taxed. The resources of a nation were drained to create one man's hedonistic vision. Morals and art can be uneasy bedfellows, where the art is great and yet the morality of its creation stinks like the marshes it was built on. But still, Versailles shines like a shimmering image of a perfect world, a world where the arts and sciences reigned as much as did the occupant of the throne. The party had to come to an end. It's dead now. The ghosts have departed in despair and bloodshed, and the glorious gilded sepulchre remains without a purpose, other than to be there for its own sake. The storm clouds had gathered over France, and indeed the rest of Europe, and Versailles was not to escape the storm. The passage of time allows us to marvel without guilt, but the gods who inhabit the sacred groves punished the hubris of its creators and brought their regime down to perish in the gutter, a World Heritage Site where the heritage may be as much in memories of the means of its creation as in the glittering palaces, groves and fountains which survive to entertain our modern, kingless world.